Hey everybody, welcome to Uzuri Gardens. This is a zoo/theme park that Geekism and Masked Bandit have been working on for the past couple of months, and they've been releasing episodes every week on their channels, and I highly recommend to check it out. It's a really interesting and very heavily themed park, similar to real life parks like the what is that park called again? The Universal Islands of Adventure and the Busch Gardens, for instance, and I'm just showing off some of these shots to give you an example of what everything is looking like so far. And a few weeks ago they addressed me asking me if I was interested in building a coaster for the park. So I agreed to that, and then I messed up on a couple of things which I'll try to explain. But just before that, I want to say really quickly that I'm going to be working on a GCI coaster in this episode, as you might be able to tell from the title and thumbnail of this video. And yeah, it's going to be interesting to work on one of these again, because they're always quite difficult to do. And therein lies also the problem that I ran into, because while this was supposed to take about a week or maybe two, it ended up taking way longer than that. And to Geekism and Masked Bandit, I'm terribly sorry for taking so long to finish this coaster. As for you guys who are watching this right now, you'll find out eventually why this ended up taking so long. Basically, Jonty suggested to build a GCI coaster, and I thought that was a really interesting idea, but one of the things that I've always struggled with most with these kinds of coasters isn't even necessarily the track work itself, but really the supports. GCI coasters have a very typical set of supports, and even though I wasn't really thinking that I would be going into support work when I was starting this build, I eventually decided to start doing that, and by the time I started, I wanted to finish it as well. So the majority of time that I'll be spending on this is actually going to be support work, and I'm not even going to show off all of it. But still, I had to split this into two videos just because it ended up being so much video that I had to cover. And there's just so much work into making this wooden coaster happen that it ended up taking me a few weeks to finish this, with some Parkitect and Planet Zoo coming in between. So that explains why it's been taking so long. So without further ado, I do want to move into more fun parts of this videos, because I don't just want to be a negative Nancy for the whole time. So yeah, for one, I'm back to building a GCI coaster, which is something that I never thought would happen, because I've done this, or I've tried this once before, which was a coaster called Gambit, which I made a video for over 2 years ago, I think now. Which is quite a long time ago, and even though I was super happy with how it turned out, I really only got the layout done, and even that alone took me a long time. So one of the things that I wanted to do differently this time is to just try and use long track pieces. When I was building Gambit, I was using the 4-meter method to try and get an as accurate as possible GCI coaster in terms of the shaping of the elements. But that ended up taking so long that realistically I figured I wouldn't have time to work on a track like this for this build. So I'm just using the regular track pieces. I did a few test layouts to see if this could actually work, by using track pieces that are extra long instead of using really short ones, because the way that these coasters transition, I figured might actually lend itself quite well to really long track pieces, so long as every track piece transitions into the next one at a certain place, either where a curve starts or ends, or where a slope starts or ends, which might not make that much sense as I'm explaining this, and I definitely need to go into how GCI coasters are made and what makes them so distinct from other wooden coasters, just to explain this a little bit better. But yeah, I thought it would be possible to build a decent feeling GCI coaster using really long track pieces, and honestly, without trying to spoil too much, I think it worked out alright. I'm pretty happy with the end result. It's not quite as good as Gambit was, but that was with the 4-meter method, and it took me something like 10 hours to get just the layout done on that one, so I swore to myself to never do that again. And for the record, the reason why Gambit never had a follow-up episode is also because of the supports. I gave the file to Free the Bear because I was being a total dick. I didn't want to try the supports myself, so I gave it to him, and he started on it very boldly, and I think he spent 2 hours supporting just the first drop before giving up on that one. So yeah, that's why I never made a follow-up video on Gambit. It just wasn't doable as much as I liked the layout. So anyway, I've talked a bunch about GCI Coasters, but there's probably many people here who haven't seen the Gambit video and are wondering what the hell all of this is about. So GCI is a coaster manufacturer. It stands for Great Coasters International, and they make only wooden coasters, and they're very well known for their distinct style of wooden coasters. And this is something which is always really hard to exactly explain, but their wooden coasters feel like no other wooden coasters. Especially to coaster enthusiasts, they are a very popular manufacturer, and they just give really snappy layouts with very quick transitions and quick pops of airtime everywhere, which are really fun, and they're also kind of rough, but not in a bad sense. They tend to throw you around, but they never really hurt. It's all on purpose, and it's all very controlled. And they're absolutely amazing to ride. Some of my favorite wooden coasters are GCI coasters. So, you know, even though they are really difficult to build, they are my favorite to build as well. So that's a double-edged sword if there's any. Now, the thing that makes them so hard to build, and that makes them, in my opinion, maybe even the most difficult coaster to realistically build in Planet Coaster, just comes down to the way that they are designed. I don't know the exact methods which the company uses to design their layouts, but from what I have heard from some people who have more insider knowledge, is that they tend to design their coasters not per se in a 3D space, but lay out the map from a top-down perspective in 2D beforehand, mapping out where all of the curves and straight pieces and everything go. And in doing so, they use just mostly straight pieces and curves and parabolas to make the transitions between the curves, which are pretty much just parts of circles. And after that is when they start adding the height differences. So the difference in height are sort of made separately from the curves themselves. So instead of just mapping out the coaster in a 3D space right away, they just plot down a 2D overview first and then start raising certain areas and lowering other areas. And also paying attention, for instance, to avoid having curved tracks going over different tracks. So whenever the coaster will be going over another part of the coaster, it'll quickly transition to a straight piece of track, for instance. And finally, after that process is when they start adding the banking. And because of this, the movement of, well, going upside down or going from side to side, as well as the movement of banking, they're all kind of separated. And it just results in a very unique feeling layout. And I really can't talk much about any specific processes of designing these layouts beyond that. I'm quite a noob when it comes to that as well. But just know that it results in unique layouts with a very unique kind of track shaping, and you can't just build a GCI coaster by, you know, looking at a real one and trying to sort of follow the general layout. It all comes down to how the track transitions from one curve to the other, or how the track just banks and moves in general. And it's about as hard to build as it is to explain for me, as you might be able to tell. Now let's get into some more fun stuff, because the layout building for this episode is pretty much done. I didn't want to finish the whole layout right away, but at this point I wanted to move into the supports, so we're gonna have a bit of a change of pace here. Because, well, Geekism and Masked Bandit gave me quite a challenge with this plot, because they gave me this plot outlined by the white lines, which you can see in the distance in the background. And in the middle of this plot was an access road, which is the grey area that you can see down below the coaster track here. And whatever I would do, I should keep the access road clear, because this is where all of the backstage areas are going to be connected to the outside world. So, whatever kind of construction materials or trucks or staff, wants to get into the other areas of the park, they're gonna have to cross underneath the wooden coaster here. So this was quite a logistical challenge. For one, I had to build the layout to move around this road, which is why there is a tunnel right after the first drop going underneath this road. But for the areas which are going over this road, I really need to figure out a support solution to try and make this work. Now, this year at IAAPA, I think it was, which is a very big convention for coaster manufacturers, GCI showcased a new model, which is a very new generation wooden roller coaster with some inversions and steel supports as well. And the coaster they showed off had black steel supports underneath the lift hill, which in their case I think was mostly to allow the lift hill to be steeper and to be built over complex track, and maybe also to just look really cool, because I do have to admit it looks pretty interesting. But in my case, it is pretty much the only way in which I can cover the access road and leave this area underneath the lift hill open. So I'm building the weird steel support structure underneath the lift hill there, not really for aesthetic purposes, but really to keep the area underneath the lift hill clear. So yeah, it's very much there with a purpose, even though I do think it does look pretty cool. I really wasn't sure if this would work very well. After all, these supports are slightly different from the ones that GCI showed at IAAPA, but I think it works out quite well, and it definitely gives the coaster a very unique feeling. And for another part of the layout, I used the people mover ride to remove the track supports underneath the straight section. And then for this area, I need to figure out another way. I'm gonna add some steel beams to that later and go for more traditional standard wooden coaster supports. Now this is where the really fun part begins. This is where I get into the actual supports of the coaster, the regular wooden supports that you'll see on any GCI coaster. And on lower sections like this, it's going to be a bit easier than on some of the higher sections. Basically, you get some diagonal beams sticking out from each of the support pillars, and then between that, some more diagonal beams. Did I just say beans instead of beams? Between that, you get some more diagonal beams to connect these. It sounds a bit weird, but basically this is what every GCI coaster does around its curves, and I'm basically just following that general support structure. So this is not too difficult in any sense. I just used some pictures as reference to see what kind of support beams the company would use for different kinds of elements, and generally the supports are very similar most of the time, so it's not too difficult to try and follow along there. But what does make this very difficult is that every single beam you place has to be adjusted to the beams around it, because of course these beams are following curves, they have different degrees of steepness, I guess, is that a word? You know what I mean. And I also need to make sure that all of these beams actually connect to each other as well, so it's not so much a challenge as just a very time-consuming thing to make sure that each of these beams connects to another one. So yeah, I also had to figure out what I would talk about in this segment, because basically from here on out, most of the work is basically going to be this. And when I was doing this, I had to listen to a lot of podcasts and things trying to keep my mind sane while I was trying to place the same beams over and over again. So I don't know if I would recommend doing something like this. Doing custom supports this way is really gonna, have an effect on your mental health eventually, I think. But for these videos, I thought it might be interesting if I just talk about some of my favorite GCIs and maybe a bit more about the company in general, because it is really interesting. Even though I haven't written many GCIs myself, I think there's a good chance that even if you haven't heard of the company, or if you're not that much of a coaster enthusiast, if you've been on a few wooden coasters, you've probably been on a GCI at some point. For me, my favorite examples in Europe are always Wodan and Troy in Europa Park and Toverland respectively. I've only been on Troy myself, but out of any of the traditional wooden coasters that I've been on, it is by far my favorite. A really good example of what GCI coasters tend to do. And some of the things in Troy actually return in this layout. So if we look at the first drop, for instance, that I'm supporting here, almost every GCI coaster will have a curving, sloped drop like this. They usually don't have a steep, straight drop. They usually just have curves everywhere, and the drop is no exception to that. There are a few exceptions, like George in the Dragon in the Efteling, or really I should say Joris in the Draak. I'm a Dutch person myself. But which is also a really good GCI that I've been on myself. But aside from a few cases, most of them have drops that are almost identical to the one that I've built here. An example for this drop that I used was actually El Toro, which is not the El Toro in Six Flags, but the one in Plön in Germany, which has a very similar drop, and it comes down into a tunnel underneath a footpath, I think, which is the reference that I used for this drop coming into the tunnel. Although the change here is that after the first drop, after this curve here, it dips a little bit lower into that tunnel. So I think that's actually a really cool element to start off the ride with. So you first get into the main drop, and then right after that you drop down again, down into that tunnel. So you probably catch some airtime right after this drop, even if it's not that much, and if it's just for a short amount of time. That is just very typical about GCI coasters. You rarely get very long sustained airtime, but it's usually just little pops of airtime all throughout the layout. So yeah, that is one very typical element about GCI coasters. Another one is the station fly-through, or is it a station flyby? I don't know, either one of those words. In any case, what usually happens on these coasters is that somewhere halfway through the layout, you'll have a segment where the track goes back through the station, but not really the station, it just goes through the station building, but a bit above the actual station, with a straight piece of track, which is very cool if you're on the coaster, because you fly back through the station somewhere during the middle of the layout, which is really nice. But if you're standing in these stations, as I've personally been able to tell on Troy and Toverland, they make a lot of noise. It is extremely loud. So yeah, it is cool, even if it is a bit uncomfortable if you're standing in the station itself, because the coaster is passing by at full speed. But yeah, it's one of these typical GCI things that other coaster manufacturers don't really seem to do as much. And yeah, I guess those are the most typical elements. Whenever a coaster enthusiast would think of typical elements of a GCI coaster, I think the station fly-throughs and the curved drops are just about the most typical things. I've also seen some other quirky elements. I've seen that recent GCI coasters tend to have two planks on the middle of the track, but to be completely honest, I have no idea what these planks are for exactly. Maybe it's just to support the track a bit more, keep it more steady, but really I'm not sure. But there's a GCI called Gold Striker, which is, I believe in California is Great America, but I'm not entirely sure. It's in the US in any case. I think it's that park. But yeah, it has also two planks running down the middle of the track, for instance, and I'm not entirely sure why that is. I've seen it on some other coaster manufacturers as well, but it seems to be more of a recent trend. But yeah, that is just about it. And then there's the support work, which is very typical as well, especially around all of these curves, because they tend to fan out from the curves and have these diagonal beams in between all of these squares. So the method that I use to make all of these supports is basically to use the align to scenery tool to align these planks to the track, which is a bit finicky because you have to align them using the wooden supports, but it's hard to get that placement entirely right. And then from those slanted beams, I use the horizontal beams to connect these together. Then you get some squares, and then I fill in these squares with diagonal beams like this. And finally add some vertical beams right in the middle of that to connect back into the ground. And I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here, well actually quite a bit, to when all of these supports are done to show the last step, which is basically to add the footers, which is the small concrete elements at the bottom of all of the supports to hold them up. And I really have to thank Feed the Bear here, because he was willing to take up some of the supports of Gambit, even if for a bit, because going back there I pretty much figured out what the best way to go about recreating the supports in Planet Coaster was, and that is just to take the art shapes and color them in just about the same color as the in-game footers. So these are not quite as detailed as the in-game ones, but I do think they work better than any of the footers that we've gotten from the support pieces in the game. It doesn't have to be too complicated, I think. It doesn't have to be super detailed. In fact, I don't know if I want it to be detailed because, well, thinking of the park for poor old Geekism and Masked Bandit, who have been waiting for me for weeks to try and place some wooden beams, the more I can keep this low poly, the better it would also be, because this is a park in the end, so I do have to consider how many pieces that I'm placing here, so as not to lag up the game too much. Even though the pavilion that they've just built, that they've got built from somebody else, was also a lot of pieces, but for my part I'm gonna try and keep this as, low as I can get it in terms of the item count. Even though at the end I can already spoil that it's definitely going to contain quite a few thousand wooden beams, which are all individually placed, almost all individually placed. So yeah, again, if you ever think about building a GCI in Planet Coaster, take my word of advice, don't. But if you really, really want to do it, I guess some of the tips that I've given in this video, to try and look up real POVs of GCI coasters, base your shaping on that, and do the supports pretty much the way I've been doing it in this video, and then you should be golden. Now, I'm gonna end the video here because I didn't want the video to become too long. I'm gonna continue it in the next one, which is going to pick up where this one left off. And yeah, I hope to see you guys next time. Should be coming out soon. I just didn't want to make a single video of over an hour long. So thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.